Line 3, using the quadratic formula to solve equations. When we use the quadratic formula, we are using x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a in order to solve what x is. When we are doing this, if there is a negative underneath that radical sign, we have to remember that we're going to get no solution. And then with these, if your radical simplifies, you're going to have two answers. Remember your formulas for your quadratic form or for your trinomials: x squared plus bx plus c. That's where you're getting your a, b, and c from for your quadratic formula. So if we want, for example, a, we have 2x squared plus 3x minus 5 is equal to 0. Our equation is equal to 0, so we can plug or pick out our a, which is 2, our b, which is 3, and our c, which is negative 5. We're going to plug this in to x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. So this is going to leave us with x is equal to negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 3 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 5 all over 2 times 2. So if we simplify this, we're going to have negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 9 plus 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 5 is 40 all over 2 times 2, which is 4. So this simplifies even further to be negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 49 over 4. So we're going to separate this into two equations once we get that square root of 49, which is 7. So x is equal to negative 3 plus or minus 7 over 4. So this is x is equal to negative 3 minus 7 over 4, as well as x is equal to negative 3 plus 7 over 4. So simplifying this even further, you have x is equal to negative 3 minus 7. That's going to give us x is equal to negative 10 over 4. And then we have x is equal to negative 3 plus 7, which is 4 over 4. We're simplifying this even further, so x is equal to negative 5 over 2, and x is equal to 1. For b, we have 9x squared plus 12x minus 1 is equal to 0. So our a is 9, our b is 12, our c is negative 1. Again, we have x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. So this is going to leave us with x is equal to negative 12 plus or minus the square root of 12 squared minus 4 times 9 times negative 1 all over 2 times 9. So we simplify this. We have x is equal to negative 12 plus or minus the square root of 144 plus, because a negative times a negative is a positive, 4 times 9 is 36 all over 18. From here, we're going to add the 144 and the 36, so we're going to have negative 12 plus or minus the square root. The 4 plus the 6 gives us 10. The 4 plus 3 is 7 plus 1 is 8, and then that 1 goes in front. So the square root of 180 over 18. That 180 is 18 and 10. The 10 is 2 and 5. 18 is 2 and 9. The 9 is 3 and 3. So 3 times 2, leave the square root of 5. So x is equal to negative 12 plus or minus 6 square root 5 all over 18. Now that 12, the negative 12, the 6, and the 18 are all divisible by 3. They're also all divisible by 6, so we're going to divide all of them by 6. This negative 12 is going to become negative 2. The 6 becomes a 1. The 18 becomes a 3. So this is going to leave us with x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 5 all over 3. For c, we have 2x is equal to x squared minus 4. So we want to bring this 2x over and write it in standard forms where we have x squared minus 2x minus 4 is equal to 0. Our a is 1, our b is negative 2, and our c is negative 4. So we're plugging it into our quadratic formula. X is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. So x is equal to negative times negative 2 plus or minus the square root of negative 2 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 4 all over 2 times 1. So we're going to simplify. X is equal to a positive 2 because a negative times a negative 2 is positive 2 plus or minus the square root of 4 plus 16 all over 2. From here, that 4 plus 16 is 20. So we have 2 plus or minus the square root of 20 over 2. That 20 is 2 and 10. 10 is 2 and 5. So that's 2 square root 5. So x is equal to 2 plus or minus 2 square root 5 all over 2. These 2's are all going to simplify to become 1's. And we're just going to have x is equal to 1 plus or minus the square root of 5. For D, we have x squared is equal to x minus 8. I want to move that x and that negative 8 over because my x squared already has a coefficient that's positive. So I'm going to subtract the x from each side. I get x squared minus x is equal to negative 8. And then I'm going to add that 8 to both sides to get x squared minus x plus 8 is equal to 0. So from here, my a is 1, my b is negative 1, and my c is 8. So I'm going to plug this into our quadratic formula. We're going to have x is equal to a negative times negative 1 plus or minus the square root of negative 1 squared minus 4 times 1 times 8 all over 2 times 1. So from here, those two negatives become positive, so x is equal to positive 1 plus or minus the square root of negative 1 squared is 1 minus 4 times 1 is negative 4 times 8 is negative 32 all over 2 times 1, which is 2. We simplify this further to give us x is equal to 1 plus or minus the square root of negative 31 all over 2. We cannot take the square root of a negative, so this is no solution. For E, we're given x squared minus 6x minus 7 is equal to 0. So for this one, our A is 1, our B is negative 6, our C is negative 7. So we're going to have x is equal to negative times negative 6 plus or minus the square root of negative 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 7 all over 2 times 1. So this is going to be x is equal to a positive 6 plus or minus the square root of 36 plus 28 all over 2. So this simplifies further to be x plus or minus the square root of 6 plus 8 is 14. Carry the 1. 4 plus 2 is 6. So that's 64 all over 2. That square root of 64 is 8. So this is going to be x is equal to 6 plus or minus 8 over 2. So we're going to separate this into two equations. X is equal to 6 minus 8 over 2, as well as x is equal to 6 plus 8 over 2. The 6 minus 8 gives us negative 2, so x is equal to negative 2 over 2. And the 6 plus 8 gives us 14, so it's 14 over 2. So x is equal to negative 1 and 14. For f, we have 2x equals 8x. 2x squared is equal to 8x minus 7. So I'm going to subtract the 8x from both sides. I'm going to get 2x squared minus 8x is equal to negative 7. Then I'm going to add the 7 to both sides to give myself 2x squared minus 8x plus 7 is equal to 0. My a is 2, my b is negative 8, and my c is 7. So from here, we're going to have x is equal to a negative times negative 8 plus or minus the square root of negative 8 squared minus 4 times 2 times 7 all over 2 times 2. So simplifying this further, we're going to have x is equal to 8 plus or minus the square root of 64 minus 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 7 is 56 all over 4. So we're going to subtract underneath that radical to give us 8 plus or minus the square root of 64 minus 56. The 64 is a 14. The 6 is going to turn into a 5. So 14 minus 6 is 8. And then the 5 minus 5 is 0. So it's just the square root of 8. From here, that 8 is 2 and 4. The 4 is 2 and 2. So 2 square root 2. So x is equal to 8 plus or minus 2 square root 2 all over 4. The 8, 2, and 4 all simplify by dividing them by 2. So we're going to have 4, 1, and 2. So x is equal to 4 plus or minus the square root of 2 all over 2. If we look at some extra practice problems, for number 1, we are going to have x squared minus 3x minus 10 is equal to 0. So our a is 1, our b is negative 3, and our c is negative 10. So we're going to plug this into our quadratic formula. We're going to have x is equal to a negative times negative 3 plus or minus the square root of negative 3 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 10 all over 2 times 1. Alright, so if we simplify this, those two negatives are going to turn positive. So we're going to have x is equal to 3 plus or minus the square root of negative 3 squared is 9 minus 4 times 1 is negative 4. Negative 4 times negative 10 is a positive 10 all over 2. So x is equal to 3 plus or minus the square root of 49 all over 2. The square root of 49 is 7, so x is equal to 3 plus or minus 7 over 2. This is going to give us x is equal to 3 minus 7 over 2, as well as x is equal to 3 plus 7 over 2. So we're going to subtract here, so 3 minus 7 is negative 4 over 2. We're going to add for the other. 3 plus 7 is 10 over 2. So x is equal to negative 2 and 5. 10 divided by 2 is 5. For 2, we're given 2s squared. 2s squared minus 3s minus 2 is equal to 0. So our a is 2, our b is negative 3, and our c is negative 2. So plug it into our quadratic formula. We have x is equal to a negative times negative 3 plus or minus the square root of negative 3 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 2 all over 2 times 2. So this is going to simplify to be positive 3 plus or minus the square root of 9 plus 8 times 2 is 16 all over 4. So simplify this further, x is equal to 3 plus or minus the square root of 25 all over 4. Keep going, x is equal to 3 plus or minus 5 over 4. So we're going to separate this to be x is equal to 3 minus 5 over 4, as well as x is equal to 3 plus 5 over 4. So then simplifying further, we get that x is equal to negative 2 over 4, as well as x is equal to 8 over 4. So our two solutions are x is equal to negative 1/2 as well as 8 divided by 2 is 4. So negative 1/2 and 4. We're going to look at number 3. So we have 5z squared minus 11z plus 2 is equal to 0. So our a is 5, our b is negative 11, and our c is 2. So this is going to give us x is equal to negative times negative 11 plus or minus the square root of negative 11 squared minus 4 times 5 times 2 all over 2 times 5. So then we simplify, we get x is equal to 11 plus or minus the square root of 121. Negative 4 times 5 is negative 20, times 2 is negative 40. So 121 minus 40 all over 10. If we simplify this further, we get x is equal to 11 plus or minus 1 minus 0 is 1. 2 minus 4 you can't do, so the 2 turns into a 12, making the 1 a 0. 12 minus 4 is 8. So it's the square root of 81 all over 10. From here, that square root of 81 is 9. So x is equal to 11 plus or minus this 9 over 10. So we're going to separate it into two equations. X is equal to 11 minus 9 over 10, as well as x is equal to 11 plus 9 over 10. So this is going to be x is equal to 2 over 10, and x is equal to 20 over 10. Or sorry, yes, 10. This should be a 10. Alright, so from here, we're going to have x is equal to 1/5, as well as x is equal to 2. From here, if we look at number 4, we have 2y squared minus 6y minus 8 is equal to 0. So our a is 2, our b is negative 6, and our c is negative 8. Plugging them into our quadratic formula, we're going to have a negative times negative 6 plus or minus the square root of negative 6 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 8 all over 2 times 2. So if we simplify this, it's going to be x is equal to 6 plus or minus the square root of 36. The negative 4 times 2 is negative 8. Negative 8 times negative 8 is a positive 64. All over 2 times 2 is 4. So x is equal to 6 plus or minus the square root of 100 over 4. We're going to simplify this further to be x is equal to 6 plus or minus 10 all over 4. So we're going to separate it into two equations to give us x is equal to 6 minus 10 over 4, as well as x is equal to 6 plus 10 over 4. So this is going to give us x is equal to negative 4 over 4, and x is equal to 16 over 4. So our answers for this one are negative 1 as well as 4. For, which one was that? 5. For number 5, they give us z squared minus 5z minus 6 is equal to 0. So our a is 1, our b is negative 5, and our c is negative 6. So this is going to give us x is equal to a negative times negative 5 plus or minus the square root of negative 5 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 6 all over 2 times 1. So these two negatives turn into a positive, so x is equal to 5 plus or minus the square root of 25. The negative 4 times negative 6 is a positive 24, times 1 is just 24. all over 2. So x is equal to 5 plus or minus the square root of 49 all over 2. So x is equal to 5 plus or minus 7 over 2. This is going to give us x is equal to 5 minus 7 over 2, as well as x is equal to 5 plus 7 over 2. So x is equal to negative 2 over 2, and x is equal to 12 over 2. So our answers for this one are x is equal to negative 1 and 6. For number 6, we're going to have, or we're given m squared plus 8m plus 7 is equal to 0. So our a is 1, our b is 8, and our c is 7. So x is equal to a negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 8 squared minus 4 times 1 times 7 all over 2 times 1. So x is equal to negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 64 minus 28 all over 2. So x is equal to negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 14 minus 8 gives us 6, and then the 5 minus 2 is 3. So square root of 36 all over 2. The square root of that 36 is 6, so x is equal to negative 8 plus or minus 6 over 2. I'm going to separate this into two equations. So x is equal to negative 8 minus 6 over 2, and x is equal to negative 8 plus 6 over 2. So we have x is equal to negative 14 over 2, and x is equal to negative 2 over 2. So this is x is equal to negative 7, as well as x is equal to negative 1. For 7, we have, where did I write this at? 7. We have x squared minus 6x minus 11 is equal to 0. So our a is 1, our b is negative 6, and our c is negative 11. So this is going to give us x is equal to a negative times negative 6 plus or minus the square root of negative 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 11 all over 2 times 1. So our two negatives turn that negative 6 into a positive 6, so x is equal to 6 plus or minus the square root of 36 plus 44 all over 2. So x is equal to 6 plus or minus the square root of 4 plus 6 is 10. 4 plus 3 plus 1 is 8. So that's the square root of 80, and then everything's over 2. For the 80, we have 8 and 10. The 8 is 2 and 4. 4 is 2 and 2. 10 is 2 and 5. So it's 2 times 2, 4, square root 5. So x is equal to 6 plus or minus the 4 square root 5 all over 2. 6, 4, and 2 are all divisible by 2. So we're going to have a 3, a 2, and a 1. So x is just equal to 3 plus or minus 2 square root 5. For 8, we're given k squared minus 3k minus 1 is equal to 0. So a is 1, b is negative 3, and c is negative 1. So it's going to give us x is equal to a negative times negative 3 plus or minus the square root of negative 3 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 1 all over 2 times 1. So simplifying this, we're going to have x is equal to 3 plus or minus the square root of 9 minus 4 times negative 1 is positive 4 all over 2. So simplifying this further, x is equal to 3 plus or minus the square root of 13 all over 2. We cannot simplify this any further, so this is our answer. For 9, we are given r squared plus 8r plus 5 is equal to 0. So the r has a coefficient of 1, so a is 1, b is that 8, and c is the 5. So x is equal to negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 8 squared minus 4 times 1 times 5 all over 2 times 1. So simplifying this, it's going to give us x is equal to negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 64 minus 20 all over 2. So x is equal to negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 44 all over 2. That 44 is 4 and 11. The 4 is 2 and 2. So it's going to be 2 square root of 11. So x is equal to negative 8 plus or minus 2 square root of 11 all over 2. We simplify the negative 8 to become a negative 4. The 2 becomes a 1, and the second 2 becomes a 1. So it's just x is equal to negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 11. For 10, we're given n squared minus 6n minus 1 is equal to 0. So a is 1, b is negative 6, and c is negative 1. So x is equal to a negative times negative 6 plus or minus the square root of negative 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 1 all over 2 times 1. So this is going to give us x is equal to 6 plus or minus the square root of 36 plus 4 all over 2. So x is equal to 6 plus or minus the square root of 40 all over 2. That 40 is 4 and 10. The 4 is 2 and 2. 10 is 2 and 5. So 2 square root 10. So x is equal to 6 plus or minus 2 square root 10 all over 2. These 2's simplify to become 1's. The 6 becomes a 3. So it's just x is equal to 3 plus or minus the square root of 10. For 11, we're given 7x squared plus 2x minus 2 is equal to 0. So our a is 7, our b is 2, our c is negative 2. So we're going to have x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 2 squared minus 4 times 7 times negative 2 all over 2 times 7. So if we simplify this, it's going to be x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 4 plus 4 times 7 is 28. 28 times negative 2 is a positive 56 all over 14. From here, we are going to have x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 60 all over 14. The 60 is 6 and 10. The 6 is 3 and 2. The 10 is 2 and 5. So that's 2 square root 15. So x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus 2 square root 15 all over 14. The negative 2, the 2, and the 14 are all going to simplify. It's going to become negative 1, 1, and 7. So x is equal to negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 15 all over 7. For 13, we have negative 4x squared plus 2x plus 3 is equal to 0. So our a is negative 4, our b is 2, and our c is 3. So x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 2 squared minus 4 times negative 4 times 3, all over 2 times negative 4. So we're going to simplify this. We're going to get x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 4 minus 4 times negative 4 is negative 16, or sorry, positive 16. 16 times 3 is going to be 48. All over negative 8. So from here, we're going to simplify. We have x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 52 all over negative 8. The 52 is going to be 4 and 13. The 4 is 2 and 2. So this is going to simplify to be x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus 2 square root 13 all over negative 8. We're going to simplify here. The negative 2 becomes a negative 1. The 2 becomes a 1. The negative 8 becomes a negative 4. These negatives are also going to become positive. So that way it's just x is equal to 1 plus or minus square root 13 all over 4. For 14, we have j squared minus 6j is equal to 13. So from here, we're going to move that 13 over. We're going to subtract it from each side to get j squared minus 6j minus 13 is equal to 0. So then we're going to substitute or pick out our a, which is 1, our b, which is negative 6, and our c, which is negative 13, and then substitute these into our quadratic formula. So we have negative times a negative 6 plus or minus the square root of negative 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 13 all over 2 times 1. So this is going to simplify to be x is equal to 6 plus or minus the square root of 36. The negative 4 times 1 is negative 4. Negative 4 times negative 13. 4 times 3 is 12. Carry the 1 plus 1 is 52 all over 2. So from here we have x is equal to 6 plus or minus the square root of 52 and 36. The 6 and 2 is 8. The 3 and 5 is 8. So this is the square root of 88, and then everything's over 2. From here, that 88 is 8 and 11. The 8 is 2 and 4. The 4 is 2 and 2. So that's 2 square root 22. So x is equal to 6 plus or minus 2 square root 22 all over 2. We're simplifying these. The 2's become 1s. The 6 becomes a 3. So it's just x is equal to 3 plus or minus the square root of 22. For 15, we have 4y squared minus 12y is equal to negative 7. We're going to add that negative 7 to both, add the 7 to both sides. So that way we have 4y squared minus 12y plus 7 is equal to 0. Our a is 4, our b is negative 12, and our c is 7. So x is equal to a negative times negative 12 plus or minus the square root of negative 12 squared minus 4 times 7 all over 2 times 4. So from here, x is equal to 12 plus or minus the square root of 144 minus 4 times 4 is 16, and then that's 16 times 7 is 112 all over 8. From here, subtract underneath that radical, so x is equal to 12 plus or minus the square root of 144 minus 112 gives us 32 all over 8. The 32 is 4 and 8. The 8 is 4 and 2, so that's 4 square root 2. So x is equal to 12 plus or minus 4 square root 2 all over 8. We're going to divide the 12, the 4, and the 8 all by 4. The 12 is going to become a 3, 4 becomes a 1, 8 becomes a 2. So x is equal to 3 plus or minus the square root of 2 all over 2. For 16, we have, or we're given, 4v squared is equal to 10v minus 5. And we're going to move that 10v over by subtracting it from both sides. We get 4v squared minus 10v is equal to negative 5. We're then going to add that 5 to each side. And we get 4v squared minus 10v plus 5 is equal to 0. Our a is 4, our b is negative 10, and our c is 5. So we plug these in. X is equal to negative times negative 10 squared plus or minus the square root of negative 10 squared minus 4 times 5 all over 2 times 4. So this is going to give us a positive 10. So x is equal to 10 plus or minus, why did I put a square there? That square does not belong there. Plus or minus the square root of 10 squared is 100, minus 4 times 4 is 16, times 5 gives us 80, all over 8. From here, we're going to have x is equal to 10 plus or minus the square root of 20, all over 8. The 20 is 2 and 10. The 10 is 2 and 5, so that's 2 square root 5. So x is equal to 10 plus or minus 2 square root 5 all over 8. The 10, the 2, and the 8 will simplify by dividing all of them by 2, so 5 plus or minus 1 square root 5 all over 4. So this is just going to be x is equal to 5 plus or minus the square root of 5 all over 4. For 17, we have 3x squared plus 8x is equal to 2. So we're going to move that 2 over by subtracting it from each side. So 3x squared plus 8x minus 2 is equal to 0. Plug their values in. Your a is 3, your b is 8, your c is negative 2. So this is x is equal to a negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 8 squared minus 4 times 3 times negative 2 all over 2 times 3. So this is going to leave us with x is equal to negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 64. The negative 4 times 3 is negative 12. Negative 12 times negative 2 is a positive 24 all over 6. So from here, we have x is equal to negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 64 plus 24 is going to give us 88 all over 6. From here, that 88 is 8 and 11, the 8 is 2 and 4, the 4 is 2 and 2, so that's 2 square root 22. So we're going to have x is equal to negative 8 plus or minus 2 square root 22 all over 6. From here, the 8 that is going to turn into a negative 4, the 2 becomes a 1, the 6 becomes a 3, so that's x is equal to negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 22 all over 3. For our last example here for number 18, we are given 2r is equal to 5 minus 4r squared. So I'm going to start by moving that 4r squared over so that way it's positive. I'm going to be left with 4r squared plus 2r is equal to 5. I want to move that 5 over by subtracting it as well. So we have 4r squared plus 2r minus 5 is equal to 0. My a is 4, my b is 2, my c is negative 5. So we're going to plug these in. X is equal to negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 2 squared minus 4 times negative 5 all over 2 times 4. From here, if I simplify, I'm going to have x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 4. Negative 4 times 4 is negative 16. Negative 16 times 5 gives us 80. So it's going to be a positive 80 all over 8. So from here, we're going to have x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 84 all over 8. The 84 is 4 and 21. The 4 is 2 and 2. 21 is 3 and 7, so that's 2 square root 21. So x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus 2 square root 21 all over 8. From here, my negative 2, and my 8 are all going to simplify to become negative 1, 1, and 4. So our final answer for this one is going to be negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 21 all over 4.